So this is part two on how I talk about migration whenever I do book readings or get invited to talk about my book called Clarita Migrates North, and my name is Antonio Alaniz. So in the first segment, I talked about creating a rapport with students, connecting the word migration to what students know and what they understand, and continue talking about how migration relates to students' lives. So one thing about Clarita Migrates North is how students are so smart to pick up on things that are implicitly there or things that are communicated in an implicit way. One of the things is a character called Don Roberto, who is the helper, who goes in Clarita's world and gives the family a map. A map to go through the desert, to cross through the heat, and eventually reach safety. And the Roberto is a pivotal character because he is the one who guides the family get there safely. And after they cross the border, after they cross the river, the Roberto reappears and he takes them to Abuelita's house. And this is important because students have asked me in the past, how come does Don Roberto get to cross with a car? How come the familia or the family has to cross through the border, through the desert? Why is this the case? So one of the things here is to describe, again, not tell students what to think, but to describe migration as something that's happening, specifically using the phrase that certain people get permission to go through and certain people don't get permission to get through because of the law. And we talk about what the law means. And of course, I'm not a lawyer. I don't get into immigration law or talk about theory like that. And whenever I talk to students, because again, my purpose is not to do that. And my thing with creating this talk with students is to, again, introduce them to what migration means and why some people have the permission to cross. And it really, really is helpful for me to talk about this because it's reality. It's what people are going through. Of course, I don't talk about, people who are documented, people who are undocumented, about some of the words that they may hear. And I think that it's a way for them to understand in a way that is, again, not simple, but just enough for them to grasp the importance about why people get to move from one place to another and why others don't get to do that. I have talked about other words. One word recently that I used was the word coyote, which translates to coyote in English. And I define it as someone who helps someone else cross the border. So again, I introduce students to what is happening and what is important. So again, I don't tell them how to feel. I don't tell them what to believe in. I describe simply what happens. Because again, I get invited to school settings and things like that it's sometimes difficult. I would say many times difficult to talk about these kinds of things that, sometimes it's difficult to talk about them. So one thing that I really learned in my work with journalists and listening to journalism is a technique that describes what happens, but essentially lets the reader or the listener form an opinion. So that is something that I really am borrowing from this field to my work. I describe migration, I describe why people migrate, and talk to students about what that means to them. And it's important for me for them to create an opinion on their own. Of course, I go into why people migrate. We talk about why people migrate in terms of moving from one place to another. We talk about class. We talk about why sometimes people move from Mexico to the US in terms of how much money they earn. So we talk a little bit about cost of living. We talk about things that sometimes we might not think about. And that's something that it's really helpful to create a conversation around why the cost of living is more difficult, or people have more difficulty making a living in one place, or versus the United States. We could argue too that the United States cost of living is rising, and it's really, really rich when we have a rich conversation around why people migrate from one place to another. So, again, that's something that really happens. So, to talk about migration, I describe it, I define it, and again, let students create an opinion about what happens and what they believe in. Now, personally, one thing is to have personal beliefs, and one thing is to present the book. Personally, I am against family separation. I'm against all the ICE attacks that are happening, all the fear, all the hopelessness that's happening. And I want to use this book to resist, to denounce, to talk against all these actions that are happening. And it really is an offering to talk against all those things. But again, it's not my place to talk about these personal beliefs in these settings, because again, one thing as an educator is to present what's happening and let students make a viewpoint about what they see. It's difficult, and I'm struggling with some things that I'm thinking about out loud, but it's important for me to have this conversation, to give and document what I'm thinking through. You know, I don't want to make it seem like I'm saying that I'm going to let students create a, celebratory opinion about what's happening. It's not that, it's just that I need to still continue to refine my thinking around what I want to tell and say. And of course, this is a working audio essay. It needs more work. It needs more things to talk about. But I did want to say and talk about these points openly and in a way that it's accessible. So I'm closing with that. I know that this can expand to many more thoughts, many more things that I will continue to tinker at. But I just want to thank you all for being here. My name is Antonio Alaniz, and I am documenting my journey as a Mexican first-time self-published children's picture book author and illustrator of my book called Clarita Migrates North. Thank you so much.